Welcome to this video on the subject Shakespeare was Irish, which is the subject of this book here. As you can see, Shakespeare was Irish. And if I could just describe the cover for a second. Obviously, you can see there the subtitle of the book. It says, "Did you ever hear the like? Did you ever dream of such a thing?" And that's actually from one of Shakespeare's plays. It's called Pericles, is the name of the play. And if you listen to that and you listen to those words, I mean, it is pure Irish diction. It's very much the type of English that they speak in Ireland. It's for me anyway. It reads very much like an Irish accent, just in the words. But also, if I could just describe the picture there on the cover. That picture comes from the gravestone of the Irish candidate for Shakespeare that's described in this book. Now, that's actually, as I say, it's part of his gravestone. And if you look at it there, you get the impression almost that you have a kind of an actor, and he has his hand on something on top of a little table, and his other arm is like almost as if he's given a speech. You know, his other arm is kind of giving an oration. And if you look at his head, it almost looks like he's got a pointy beard and one of those kind of doublets or collars that they had in Shakespearean time. I mean, it's a fanciful reading of the image, but it's not an unreasonable one. And here you see it on a side profile. Anyway, the point is that that's actually the classic image of Shakespeare. For example, here's the Ashbourne monument of here's the Ashbourne portrait, which many people for hundreds of years, I think, thought was Shakespeare. And one of the reasons they thought it was of Shakespeare is because they have the skull on the table and a person kind of with his hand on it. Because, as I say, it's the classic pose of Shakespeare. And you can see here's an actress from the 19th century, and they paint her with the skull and that kind of image because it's the classic image. Of course, it's the it's from Hamlet. You can see there in a modern book on Hamlet, they just put that image there because it's what you think of when you think of Shakespeare. And obviously it comes from the skull of Yorick in Hamlet. But it seems to have some antiquity. People have been talking about this for a long time. But nonetheless, it's just interesting. It's an interesting image from the headstone, and it's not very definitive that it's Shakespeare. As a matter of fact, it used to be kind of a religious image, because many holy monks would like to be reminded, if you like, of death, so that they live a good life, and so there are lots of religious reasons, as you can read in that article, why you have this image of a skull and people kind of talking to the skull, if you like. It's not by any means just Shakespeare. Its antiquity is not clear, but nonetheless, anyway, I thought it was an interesting image, which is why I have it on the cover, and we'll now begin to describe why we think he is Shakespeare. But before we do that, I suppose the obvious thing to do is to talk about the actor from Stratford-upon-Avon. And to address the simple question, many people who are new to this controversy always ask, are you saying that William Shakespeare, the actor from Stratford, didn't exist? And of course, he absolutely did exist. There's no question about it. There's an actor. He grows up in Stratford-upon-Avon. He goes to London. He's very much associated with the stage. There are numerous references to him connected to the stage. He goes back to Stratford, and it's very well documented. And then even in his will, there's another connection to the stage. So you can see there on the map, he goes from Stratford to London. By the way, so Stratford is one of the towns that you go through when you go from London to Ireland. There's even a progress of one of the Lord Deputies of Ireland, I think it's Fitzwilliam, about 1570s, and you can see the towns he goes through, and one of them is Stratford. Just by the by, so the town would have to be very familiar to Irish people that would have gone to England. In any case, yes, he existed. No problem about that at all. No question. And here he is here from the first folio. The point I'm trying to make is that, okay, you know all about him, but can you be, 1,000% sure that he wrote all the plays and the sonnets? The truth of the matter is that writing is a kind of an isolating activity. It's an isolated activity. Nobody's looking over your shoulder when you're writing for such a long period of time as this, and it's always possible, that you put your own name of what somebody else wrote. You always have to keep an open mind about these things. There are a lot of anonymous authors out there. There's a lot of pseudonyms used, etc., etc. So while it looks on the surface like you have a huge amount of evidence, and as I say, you have a huge amount of evidence that William Stratford existed, that he was an actor, that he's connected to the stage, blah, blah, blah. but you still have to keep an open mind. You don't know absolutely for certain that he wrote all of these works. And for example, I'd like you to ponder for a minute this particular book. It's an edition of Titus Andronicus, which is one of Shakespeare's plays, and it's brought out, edited by Edward Ravenscroft in December 1686. And in it, here's a quote from inside it, and which is interesting. It says, "There is a play in Mr. Shakespeare's volume under the name of Titus Andronicus, from whence I drew part of this. I have been told by some anciently conversant with the stage that it was not originally his, but brought by a private author to be acted. And he only gave some master touches to one or two of the principal parts or characters." So it's an interesting point, isn't it? I mean, even as early as this date, people are saying that there's a tradition in the stage in England that actually he didn't write all the works. So, you know, it's always a possibility that, you know, some guy is coming to the playing company and probably just selling a script, if you like, to them. So it's written by somebody else, and just for convenience sake, and maybe for other reasons, if when it's published later, they write it under one of the main actors connected to this playing company. They just write it under the name of William Shakespeare. But it's not necessarily by him. So what I'm just trying to elaborate in this little section is, look, you have to keep an open mind, okay? It's not so done and dusted as you might think. And there are reasons, particular reasons, why you'd question this interpretation, which we will come to now in the next. But why, anyway, are we questioning the normal story with respect to Shakespeare's Stratford upon Avon? Why not just accept him as the candidate, etc., etc.? Well, the reason is that there is a huge amount of scholarship goes into Shakespeare, both into his writings on the one hand and his life story on the other. An enormous amount of research. Okay, you're talking, I suppose, 300 years of gigantic, high-quality historical research and literary critical research into Shakespeare. Okay, a vast amount of research. And the problem is that they're not matching up the works of Shakespeare with the life of Shakespeare. The two of them just don't tally. If you consider for a minute, I mean, in his works, right, you have, obviously, he's a giant literary genius. I mean, that's kind of obvious. He's a huge interest in a vast number of areas, whether it be theology or falconry, I don't know, astronomy. Anyway, massively literary character. Now, you consider that, and you consider that when they examined the life of William Shakespeare of Stratford, they found no letter ever written by him to anybody for anything, and only one very small letter written to him by a guy just looking for money, a kind of a paragraph that was probably never written. That's, you know, remarkable, and it's not to be explained by the fact that, oh, this is back in Tudor times, and Stuart times, you know, you don't get much literature about poets and actors, etc. Not true, okay, not true at all. There is a vast amount of historical documentation in that particular period, and all of the other writers of the same period, your Ben Jonson, your Dekker, and all these other guys, are well documented. They all have letters by them or to them. They all have specific literary references. As a matter of fact, there's actually a book was published a few years ago that went to address that exact same question, to compare Shakespeare with all these other authors and writers, and in fact, it's only Shakespeare that you show this great gap, this great absence of literary material left by him in terms of explicitly by William Nugent of Stratford, or William Shakespeare of Stratford. Also, you look down through the works, and you see, and again, this huge scholarship has brought forward the idea that the geography of Italy, of France, somewhat less so Scotland, a certain, is seen in his works. There's kind of, it's debated sometimes, so the references, for example, to Italy, whether he got them all right. But usually it ends up that Shakespeare, for some reason, seemed to have great knowledge of the geography of these countries. But nonetheless, in his life, again, this big research into the life of William Shakespeare of Stratford, and you find that he never travelled anywhere except Stratford or London. I mean, you know, you can explain all these things about, oh, he's looking up guidebooks, etc., but it's not a very good explanation. The chances are that the real author did travel, is at least more likely. And the other one is that there is an enormous amount of research into the sort of the language used in the plays, and the sources that were used for the plays. As a matter of fact, an awful lot of the sources of Shakespearean plays come from Italy. They were originally written in Italian, and some were later translated into English. Now, it seemed to be people's assumption in Shakespeare research over the centuries that Shakespeare used the English translations from the Latin. In other words, the Italian play has somebody translated in English, and then he used that English translation. But deeper, more modern day research into the matter has proven that the person who wrote the plays was working off the original Italian text, not the English translation. Consequently, he was fluent in Italian. Now again, it's very unusual for a person in Tudor Jacobean England to be fluent in Italian who didn't visit Italy. I mean, it's not impossible. Again, none of these things are impossible, but it'd be very unlikely. By and large, you learn Italian because you went to Italy. And of course, we know for sure that he never travelled outside Stratford or London. And yes, we do know that absolutely for sure. Again, there's a huge amount of documentation. If he had visited any of these countries, we'd know about it. And then you take the other point that the whole works seem to show a tremendous knowledge of the kind of political intrigue, court life, warfare, rebellion, blah, blah, blah. So you'd imagine he knew about all that. Now that again is massively well documented. All these guys in Tudor England, have huge corpuses of letters surviving for them, etc., etc. And you can trawl through all of that and you'll find absolutely no connection between William Shakespeare of Stratford and court life and political life, etc. Nothing worth talking about. I mean, when they write biographies of Shakespeare these days, they overdo a few little bits and pieces, but absolutely nothing that makes any sense. Okay, he has no connection to the politics of England. The person does, whereas the actor doesn't, whereas the person writing the work certainly does. And again, he's very well educated. Clearly, the person who writes the works, in particular, he seems to have some sort of inside knowledge of the law. Whereas again, you go back to the life of Shakespeare, and there is no record anywhere of him having any education at all, neither formal nor informal. I say informal because his parents were illiterate, so it's very unlikely that he got much informal, good quality education. And then there's no formal education. He didn't join a university or anything like that. Now again, don't be under illusions here. If you did go to university in Tudor or Jacobean England, it is recorded. All of the registers of all the universities are all there. And for example, the man that comes forward later as the Irish candidate for Shakespeare, he studied in Oxford, it's written there. His brother studied in Cambridge, his first cousin studied in Gray's Inns. It's all written up. It's not true that it wouldn't be written up. So William Shakespeare of Stratford-on-Avon was educated nowhere, I mean, according to the records. I mean, you can make assumptions that he went to grammar school, but these are just assumptions, they're not historical facts. Now, because of this reality, an awful lot of very senior scholars all across the world are coming to the conclusion that, in fact, there's doubt, if you like, about the authorship of the Shakespearean canon, that it couldn't have been the actor from Stratford-on-Avon. You can see, for example, there's a big organisation called the Shakespeare Authorship Coalition, and they put together all these people who signed this Declaration of Doubt, including many famous people and including very large numbers of historians and literary critics and professors of universities all across the world. And so it's a serious phenomenon that people are sceptical about the authorship of, you can see a lot of famous names there, Mark Twain, a lot of actors, and Henry James, and there's no point in being dismissive of all these guys. And as I say, when it goes down, the numbers of people who signed it are hundreds of academics. So as I say, I don't think you can, people try to, but I don't think you can dismiss all of this. So we come to the Shakespeare authorship question. I.e., okay, well, if Shakespeare of Stratford-on-Avon didn't write it, then who did? Who is this gentleman that came forward to write all this stuff anonymously? And, well, there's a lot of candidates, as you'll see, for the job. In other words, they just go through the life of all these guys and they say, well, he could have written it because he seems to have, he fits the bill, he has the foreign travel, he was initially in France and Spain, he has the knowledge of the law, he has the knowledge of war for court life, blah, blah, blah. And there's a lot of different candidates. The first candidate from about the mid-19th century would have been Francis Bacon. And the more modern times, it would have been the Earl of Oxford. And still kind of the Earl of Oxford is the main candidate. And you get all kinds of people like Marlowe and whatever. Incidentally, one of the main problems the main candidates have is simply the dates. You can tell very roughly, not very accurately, but very roughly, the date at which each of the plays were written. And unfortunately for some of the people behind some of the candidates, it turns out that they're dead at the times the plays were written. Like Marlowe was killed actually in the 16th century. He didn't get into the 17th century, so it's very hard to see him writing all the plays. And the Earl of Oxford also dies early. So you're left with, difficulties that way. And just to clarify, the candidate, the Irish candidate, has perfect dates. He absolutely fits the bill on that score. So that's the beginning then of our journey here. This is why you have a Shakespeare authorship question. There are good reasons why you have a Shakespeare authorship question, and hopefully I can persuade you that that this candidate is the one to watch. So the first question we have to ask ourselves then is why not an Irish candidate? You know, there are candidates for Shakespeare all over the world. I know it's a bit ambitious to be able to identify this author without specific references, as very specific references from the playing companies to who it could be. But I suppose it's not entirely impossible. And there's a lot of very interesting books written on this. There are thousands of books written on the authorship question. It's a serious branch of modern day scholarship. There's even degrees you can get in, or this postgraduate degrees you can get in the authorship question alone. But what I find is that the one person you could put forward as the author of Shakespeare, which will cause endless merriment and abuse and whatever, is an Irish candidate. It's fascinating. I mean, the one thing you cannot say is that there could be an Irish candidate for Shakespeare. For me, it's because of an inferiority complex in Ireland. But the fact is now, so if you sit back and really consider it for a minute, there are good reasons why you'd have an Irish candidate. I mean, Ireland in general is a place where you get all sorts of great poets and playwrights in the English language anyway. But also, if you ponder it a little bit further, you might conclude that there are other reasons why it's a kind of an attractive answer to the question to say the person came from Ireland. I mean, you have, why would you want to be anonymous? Well, in reality, for example, is one of the questions that arise. Well, I mean, if you were from Ireland and maybe you were a rebel against the English state and maybe a Catholic, you definitely would want to remain anonymous. I mean, these guys are running a commercial playing house. They're trying to go into all these noblemen's houses in England to put on these plays. And if you say you're a rebel out there killing English soldiers in a previous life, they might object. I mean, it's really a bit like Jerry Adams, writing a few episodes of EastEnders or something. They're not going to watch it then. So that's the reason why you'd be anonymous. I mean, it's an idea anyway. It's quite attractive. Another question that arises in this question of the anonymity that the author wished to preserve. People say that, look, you have this gossipy world in London. They're bound to bump into the guy that's coming down the road every few weeks handing in the manuscript. Information is bound to leak out, if you like. Well, what about the idea that the Irish author is writing it in Ireland and he only sends down the manuscript and only comes to London periodically? Which if you think about it, means that there wouldn't be much gossip in London about who he was. I mean, a few people would know, Ben Jonson would have to know, but not necessarily all that many other people. And also, he would be kind of anonymous in Ireland, because all he's doing at home is writing this stuff at home, and then he sends it off to London. They don't know what he's up to, so they don't look upon him as a big playwright either. So in a curious way, that kind of helps the idea of the anonymity. I mean, it's just a few ideas. I'm just pointing out that it actually is an attractive concept, the Irish explanation for who's the author of Shakespeare. It kind of ticks a few boxes intuitively. And here's another one. It's a mystery in Shakespeare scholarship as to why, when Shakespeare originally hit the stage in England, we'd say from 1585 to 1982, that kind of period, why was he so unpopular? Because he was. What happens is that, you have a famous quotation that's clearly referring to Shakespeare in 1592 and giving out about him. And then people have gone back from that, going through earlier works, and they can see this ongoing current of controversy against this new author coming on the stage of England, Shakespeare. And why? Why not embrace this great man or whatever? Well, of course, if he was Irish, they just mightn't like the idea of an Irish guy coming along and taking over the place. And, so it's like, and here's this famous quotation anyway that starts off that kind of research. And it says, "Yet trust him not, for is an upstart crow beautified with our feathers." Now think about it. It's beautified with our feathers. Now that's an English author describing him. So obviously, you know, presumably he's not one of them. That with his tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide, suppose he's as well able to bombast out a blank verse as the best of you, and being an absolute John Factorum is in his own conceit the only shake scene in our country, not our country. You know, so again, he looks like a foreigner, and tiger's heart could be kind of an Irish rebel. And when you get to the end of this video, you'll hear about the insignia that this family use, the Irish candidate for Shakespeare, and that is used on his gravestone. And if you think about that phrase, upstart crow, it kind of matches beautifully this kind of image. And so anyway, again, that could tick the box. If it was an Irish guy coming over, dominating the stage in England in the late 16th century, they wouldn't like that in England. You know, this sort of hostility would be there. So again, I'm just saying intuitively, if people sit back and think about it properly and put aside this inferiority complex we have in Ireland, you'll see that there are good reasons why it's worth mulling over the idea that that Shakespeare came from Ireland. So that's just this section. But also, the simple point is that if you look at the works of Shakespeare, you compare that to the well-known phrases and grammar of the type of English spoken in Ireland, you find a tremendous comparison. It's actually always been accepted that the language that they use in Ireland, which you might call Hiberno English, the Irish dialect of English, it does contain a huge amount of Shakespearean phrases. That absolutely is an accepted phenomenon. It's written up to a very high degree in the people that studied the history of Hiberno English. But, and we just have to explain this but for a second. There are two theories for the date at which Hiberno English becomes, if you like, a recognised separate accent from normal English. It's a question of when we originate this kind of Irish accent, in simple terms. Now, one theory is that it develops, we'll say, maybe 18th century, maybe 19th century, and therefore it's the same English that they speak in England and speak in Ireland at the time of Shakespeare. So in other words, when we then develop our idiosyncratic Irish English, when we take on then all these Shakespearean phrases, it's only an archaism. It's only we use an older words that have died out in England. But at some earlier point, at the time of Shakespeare, we were all speaking the same language anyway. If you think about it like that, that's what a lot of scholars reckon. So in other words, traditionally, when people studied Hiberno English, that's against the dialect of English spoken in Ireland, they worked under the assumption that at the time of Shakespeare there was no individual Irish accent, and consequently they didn't care about the fact that there was Shakespeare references in modern Irish diction, because it wasn't relevant. But if you take a second theory and you consider, was it the case that the Irish accent had developed earlier than the time of Shakespeare? And if it was, then the fact that within Shakespeare you see all these Irish grammatical structures, etc., and Irish phrases and Irish words, you do actually get some Irish words in Shakespeare, but so if then the two languages were separate, I mean they are the same language, but the two dialects were separate at the time of Shakespeare, then it's very important when you see the fact that Shakespeare is using these Hiberno English phrases. If you consider for a minute, it means that it pushes you towards the proof that Shakespeare was Irish. Now I will put it to you that that last theory, that in fact Hiberno English is older than the time of Shakespeare, is the most logical one, and I make that claim because you see you can see here, for example, two contemporary plays. One on the left there is Sir John Oldcastle, 1600, and Captain Thomas Stukely, 1605. And if you read down to that act in 1600, they are mentioning there that there's an Irish candidate, and they're remarking on his speech. They obviously regard the Irish speech as different. And then at the bottom there, they try and make an attempt in the play to sort of copy the Irish accent. You know, fate, me be no servant of the Lord Cobham, me be Mac Shane of Ulster. So they're trying to put on the Irish accent. They don't always succeed, but anyway. And you can see this is similarly in the 1605 working. It says, "Be wished, I hear one stir. I fate, I know not, ask the secretary." So you can see that to an English ear, an Irish accent is very distinctive, and the Irish grammatical structure is very distinctive. And it is indeed the same kind of language that you'd hear hundreds of years later in Ireland, although it's not well written. And here's another example. It's the Irish Masque at Court that comes from the 1610s by Ben Jonson. As you can see here from this 18th century work, they say there that the performers of the play have to put on an Irish brogue because that's what's in the play. So again, at that particular time, the Irish brogue, if you like, is distinctive and to an English ear, i.e. there are two separate dialects at that particular time. Consequently, if within Shakespeare he's using these Hibernicisms, it's significant and serves to prove that Shakespeare might have been Irish. Whereas if you think that they're all the one language in 1600 and only break off hundreds of years later, then it doesn't matter that there are these Hibernicisms, if you want to call them that, in Shakespeare. So that's the debate between the two theories of the origin of Hiberno-English, and it's very important. And I have to mention this. I know it's a confusing digression, but you have to get this point carefully in order then to understand these Hiberno-English references. Because the fact of the matter is that it's been an established fact for hundreds of years, well, about 150 years, that for some reason a person with a deep knowledge of the Irish dialect of English is much better able to understand the works of Shakespeare than somebody coming from England. It's an established fact that that's the case. That the grammatical structures that Shakespeare uses, that the language that Shakespeare uses, seems to match an Irish person. A person, whose ear is attuned to the type of English they speak in Ireland. It goes on and on. There are absolutely countless references all through this history of, say, 150 years of research into the type of English spoken in Ireland, which would absolutely confirms this. So you can see there's the dialect of Ulster, and you can read that where it refers to how how Shakespeare is similar to Ulster speech, and there's another one from the Irish Monthly of 1931. Well, that's just a few throwaway references which you can read. It's absolutely everywhere. This idea that the Hiberno English is in fact is somehow very much connected to the language of Shakespeare. Now, if you wanted to examine this in any kind of a deep academic way, one of the best sources to use would be this doctorate, which is written by Dr. Patrick Leo Henry. He was an Irish scholar. He was a scholar in English and a scholar in the Irish language, and actually he was also in Scandinavia, and he educated. He was an absolutely brilliant linguist. And about 1944, during the war, he went into this townland, Clungrahan in Coothall, County Roscommon, and he recorded the type of English spoken in that particular townland. He recorded it very scientifically with all linguistic terminology, etc. And his reason for doing this was he wanted to see he wanted to capture the proper grammatical structures of Hiberno English, and he wanted also to see where they derived from the Irish language, because this area of Roscommon would have spoken Irish not all that long before he would have recorded in 1944. Also, it's a very isolated spot. It had no cinema, radio, whatever, and TV, all that wouldn't have been there those years during the war. So consequently, he can focus in on sort of the pure Hiberno English and to see was it derived from Irish. And anyway, he did all that study in 1944. That was in preparation then, as time went on, for his PhD in Switzerland in linguistics. And if you go through that thesis today, I mean, what will strike you is the degree to which he links it back to Shakespeare. Right? So what he's doing is he's just describing these particular grammatical structures, and then he's taken off the shelf, if you like, this author and that author to show that they use that as well, like Chaucer or Pope or whatever. But as far as I can tell, reading through his work, he gets about one reference to Chaucer and one reference to Pope, and he packs it with references to Shakespeare. So he's studying Hiberno English, and he's linking it back to the Irish language, and he finds again and again and again that it relates back to Shakespeare. So you can read you can read it down there and see for yourself the kind of the kind of specific references. If you want to pause the video or anything and. So you have Shakespeare's Legacy. Obviously you can see Macbeth. He uses and Venus and Adonis and Coriolanus and measure for measure. That's obviously his abbreviations there. And, but in general, he finds that, so this is common in our dialect of English and in Shakespeare, but not in modern English. You see that phrases. So the double negative, for example, that's absolutely typical Hiberno-English construction. But it's also in Shakespeare. And so he finds this comparison again and again and again and again. It's absolutely amazing. So if you want to, as I say, explore this in any great depth or scientifically, that's the place to look it up. And anyway, it's not just that phenomenon. You get you get these modern actors, for example, in recent years. In just 2009, that's just a letter in the newspaper talking about how they're putting on Shakespeare plays in rural Ireland, and they found that the way to do it properly was to put in the Irish accent, and then they didn't change a word of the original text. Pauline McGlynn, who's an actress from Father Ted, she stated specifically that in her opinion, Shakespeare sounds much better, it flows much better in an Irish accent. So it's like it's weird. In fact, she stated that she thought Shakespeare was Irish, but this is not a rare phenomenon. It really is the case that this comes across. Okay, there's a lot of such references over many years. Now, in modern times, there is new interest in what is known as the original pronunciation of Shakespeare, Shakespeare OP. Now, so what they're doing there is that they're going down through the works of Shakespeare and trying to figure out how he would have pronounced the words at the time, and then they're bringing that into modern plays and getting people to say that. And some of the people most associated with this new movement, if you want to call it that, the Shakespeare OP canon, our father and son, David on the left there, and Ben Crystal. So to clarify how they are doing this, I will refer here to a book written by an Irish judge way back in 1919, because although they're working in modern times, they're only copying the way he did it 100 years before. He was writing about, again, of this phenomenon. Everybody's found that the Shakespeare canon is using Irish diction, and he shows that how you can tell that. Well, how you can tell that is you can tell, for example, the way that the words are supposed to rhyme in the text. You find again and pen rhyming with pin, and that tells you how you're supposed to pronounce again and pen, and it links it back to the Irish way of pronouncing these things. T rhymes with obey, so then it's actually te, which of course is the Irish way to pronounce T, and etc. So he finds again and again that, so for example, you can also take puns. In Falstaff, the pun is, if reasons here as plentiful as blackberries, which doesn't mean anything. But if you pronounce reasons like raisins, if raisins here as plentiful as blackberries, then you get the pun. And also there are some spelling of words that betray the Irish accent, like murder, M-U-R-T-H-E-R. Anyway, using these methods, this couple, David Crystal and Ben Crystal and numerous others have been able to reconstruct the Irish, the authentic accent, if you like, of Shakespeare's time, of when he was writing his canon. But they have discovered that people who are listening to their work, who have listened to the YouTube videos, etc., of this Shakespeare OP, are always come to the conclusion, or frequently come to the conclusion, that it's an Irish accent. So you can see here is a blog post by David Crystal, and he says, on Shakespeare being Irish, because so many people are coming forward to him and saying, actually, folks, what you're showing here in this Shakespeare OP is an Irish accent. And but by the way, I'd just like to clarify one thing. Mostly they draw up the OP by that method that I described, Judge Barton mentioned. And here you can see also that the Irish Times is getting on the act, and they can see that many people have figured out that this OP is actually an Irish accent. But to clarify again, the Crystals, when they did this, reconstructed the original pronunciation of Shakespeare. Not only did they use the works of Shakespeare, but they also took a few works of the time which described how the English accent was in the West Country of England, or in the Stratford-upon-Avon area of England. For example, that sort of exaggerated R sound you get in that part of England, they actually put into their Shakespeare OP because it was written in a number of books, not Shakespeare books, other books at the time, as being the authentic accent. So, so for that reason, they put in this strange or sound, which isn't Irish at all. So in my opinion, if they concentrated only on the Shakespeare canon and didn't add in this stuff from other books of the time, they would have hit the Irish accent purer. But as it is, anyway, they did hit the Irish accent. As you can see, even the Irish Times is remarking on this. So we have. So that's the story. Okay, there is. I'm only giving you a taste of it here. There is an enormous amount of documentation indicating that some link between the type of English spoken in Ireland and the Shakespeare canon. Some very strange but very, very strong link. And in the book, in the Shakespeare was Irish book, you can read an awful lot more about that. I have a huge amount of references. But also there are other types of Hibernian, there's other types of traditions in Ireland about being linked to Shakespeare, which I thought people might like to see, although they're not all that important, because I can't, I don't know what to make of them. I'm not, they're kind of scattered references. Here, for example, is a magazine article from, it's a letter to a magazine in February 1793, an Irish magazine, where this guy was said to be, where this guy is remarking that he once knew a person living in Drogheda who claimed to be a grandnephew of Shakespeare. That's Drogheda, County Louth and County Meath, not far away from where the candidate that we'll talk about later came from. And here's another book from 1912, which talks about there being a tradition in the north of Ireland that Hamlet's father came from Ireland. And so you get these kind of strange references. I just put them in. I don't know how important they are. This is a fascinating story. This is a house in Kilmainham, near the city centre of Dublin. It's not a Shakespeare house, because apparently Shakespeare wrote his works there, and because of that they put a commemorative statue, as you can see over the door there. He's lost his hand, but I imagine if his hand was still there, it might be leaning on a skull on a table, because that's the usual pose of Shakespeare. But anyway, that's the traditions that surround this house, as you can see from this newspaper article from 1952 and 1964. So genuinely, this is just a very simple look at the whole issue of the accent in Ireland, the Hiberno English and the works of Shakespeare. But I can assure you, if you read this particular book, you'll see abundant evidence that people over the years really felt that the works of Shakespeare were actually written in a kind of an Irish accent. And it's both modern day scholarship that points that way and older scholarship that points that way. And so it's obviously, something to think about. Okay, so hence that ends section E. Okay, so all that's needed now is an Irish candidate for Shakespeare. So we have set the scene. Hopefully you can see from that there are good reasons to think there might be an Irish candidate for Shakespeare. Well, it was indeed the case that that a person has arrived at a conclusion that that there is an Irish candidate for Shakespeare. And it's this lady commemorated here, Elizabeth Hickey. She was Meath historian. She lived in Screen Castle in County Meath. And this is Screen Graveyard, where you'll see the monument that was mentioned at the beginning of this video on the front cover. And as you can see, she died in 2008. But she wrote this book called The Green Cockatrice. And here she was also interviewed on the BBC about it, and it was mildly famous back in the day. That's 1979. So this is the book here, The Green Cockatrice Basilisk. Basilisk is her pseudonym. And this describes an Irish candidate. The name of the guy is, and this is the book here, it's the copy she sent me, and you can see her version of the monument. And so, by the way, if you look at the top of that helmet, you see that little bird guy. That's the upstart crow, you see. But look there at the bottom right, that's the guy with the skull on the table. And the way she draws it, she assumes he's a kind of a monk. She puts that kind of line as if it's a cowl that a monk would have, or a friar. But that, that's not necessarily very obvious from the actual design, but still not. She was a great scholar, so we should heed her. Now, this is the 1567 map of Ireland. So it's a contemporary map of Ireland. Obviously, it shows the way the Tudors would have viewed Ireland. It's obviously a very bad map by modern standards, but it's interesting just to look at it for a second. And if we zoom in here, you'll see about the middle of it there. If you look at the E on Meath, and just above it, you might see marked in Delvin. So this is where this candidate came from. He came from Delvin. He was the son of the Baron of Delvin, and later on, the brother, his elder brother, became the Baron of Delvin. And just immediately to the right of where you see Delvin written there, again, right in the centre of this particular picture, you'll see a place marked Foer, and that's Fore. It's Fore Abbey. It's a very famous, beautiful place, which is very much associated with this family religiously. As you go from Fore in a kind of a diagonal from Delvin, you'll see that lake there, a lake beside these hills. And right there on the shores of that lake was a castle that was given to this particular person, William Nugent. It was given to him by the will of his father. His father died when he was quite young, but he was given this fine castle, which is still there. It was done up a few years ago, and it's a tower house. So you get. So these are the places associated with them, and then also as time went on, if you go down towards the bottom of that image, as you get towards Dublin, you might see Navan there, and a little place beside Navan called Kilcarn. It's just on the Navan Road out of the Dublin Road out of Navan, and he's very much associated with that place. It seems that he might have lived there quite a lot of the time, probably with his uncle, who certainly lived in Kilcarn. Anyway, he's born in Delvin. He's fostered out with the Maguires in Fermanagh, which is a classic Irish thing. They often foster people out to sort of build alliances between the aristocratic families of Ireland at the time. And then, after his father died, he was made a ward of court, and was brought up in London under the Earl of Sussex, who was Lord Deputy of Ireland and was a friend of his father's. And incidentally, the Earl of Sussex was a big patron of the arts in London. In particular, he had a playing house that Lord Chamberlain's men that put on plays, etc., etc. And he's very closely related to all of the big literary figures then in London, as you can see in the aforementioned book. Comes back to Ireland, and he gets married in very violent circumstances. He actually pinches his wife from her family with daggers drawn, and then as time goes on, he rebels. Now that's he gets arrested as part of the cess controversy in the mid-1570s, incidentally, but then later on in 1580. He rebels, i.e. he goes to overthrow the English government in Ireland, in concert with James Fitzmaurice Fitzgerald, who had rebelled further south, and Viscount Baltinglass, who had rebelled around Wicklow. The rebellion doesn't succeed, but he is attainted, meaning that they passed a law in the Irish Parliament stripping of his titles. According to by right of his wife, he's sometimes described as the Baron of Screen, and certainly his son would be the Baron of Screen. So this act of attainder had a big effect on him. So he flees the country. He flees to Ulster, from Ulster to Scotland, Scotland to France, France to Rome, where he's attached to the court in Rome, having come through Florence, and he learns Italian, and you'll read letters of his in the Vatican archives in Italian, and becomes a poet in Italian, and comes back to France, goes to Spain as well, from France then to Scotland, and from Scotland comes back to kind of invade Ireland in 1584. As part of very complicated international intrigues, which don't work. So he's on the run again in Ireland, and eventually he decides to surrender. And he writes a long confession and a long description of his work in late 1584. So at which point he's in Ireland, and he's pardoned in the sense that the state is not trying to chop off his head anymore, although it was earlier. But the act of attainder that had been passed against him is never lifted. So he still cannot bear arms and all these other things that come into the theory of the act of attainder. After that, about 1592, he launches a very large court case against against a corrupt judge in Ireland. It's a huge court case. It goes on for about 2 or 3 years. He prepares all the legal documents. It was about then about 1594, just immediately after the court case, which he didn't succeed with. You get the 9 Years' War in Ireland, which is, of course, is a huge military affair, And his son, who inherited Ross Castle on the shore of that lake, joins with Hugh O'Neill. And so he joins the rebellion, and his son then goes to the Low Countries, dies. His son was a poet, and his poetry is published. In the meantime, William Nugent doesn't seem to take much involvement in the 9 Years' War, unlike his brother, who was very heavily involved in it. And instead, of all things, he's launching a religious controversy in Dublin about 1600. You know, trying to prove to Protestants that Catholicism is the proper religion, etc., etc. And after that, we don't hear an awful lot more about him in the Irish papers. I mean, you hear bits and pieces, but eventually he just dies in the 1620s, and that's it. So that's the basic life of our William Nugent, the Irish candidate for Shakespeare. And you might like also just to see some pictures of these places. This is Delvin Castle, which, as I say, is probably where he was born, or near where he was born. This is Fore Abbey that I described. It's a very beautiful religious place in Ireland. You have it's an old Celtic monastery. A saint called St Fan founded Fore, and his old church is there to your right, with kind of a yew tree growing beside it. Then the Normans come in, they take over the old monastery, and they bring in Benedictine monks from France, and they set up a Benedictine monastery in Ireland, which is in the centre of your shot there, a little further down in the fields, in the bog there. That's Fore Abbey. And then on your left, that little kind of small castle structure is the anchorite cell in Fore. What happened was St Fan, who founded Fore, was actually I think an anchor, meaning kind of a hermit who wanted to go on his own to pray and didn't really want anybody around him originally. But you get monasteries forming around these guys, which is the traditional kind of model of the formation of these monasteries. But it seems that somewhere along the line they kept up this idea of having a kind of hermit. And so eventually it became a separate building for this kind of hermit. And because he had to stay in the building, they call him an anchorite. I'm just mentioning this because in the works of Shakespeare, it turns out that they mention a Father Patrick, who was a kind of a hermit. And as a matter of fact, at the time of Shakespeare, there was a hermit actually living his whole life in that little building. And his name was Patrick Beglin, so it's kind of coincidental. But anyway, that's Fore Abbey. This is Ross Castle that I described on the shores of Lough Sheelin. This is Kilcarn. This is the old stone bridge at Kilcarn, which was preserved partly through the efforts of Elizabeth Hickey, who was trying to tell people that it was Shakespeare country, and that's why it should be preserved. So that gives you the pen picture. We introduced the candidate. This is our man. We'll now see why we reckon he should be Shakespeare. Okay, so in the beginning, let's just talk generally about the literary activities of William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon, and maybe we will compare that to the Irish candidate. So as you can see here, William Shakespeare, that's the actor, grows up in Stratford-upon-Avon, goes to London, is connected to the stage, is an actor on the stage, comes back to Stratford-upon-Avon. As I say, I'm not disputing any of that. It's only a question whether he actually wrote all these works and plays. But anyway, if you look at his sort of literary milieu, his parents were illiterate. You can see there on the top left and right, you can see the mark that was used in the place of his signature on various documents. That's how you know they're illiterate. Normally, if you're illiterate, you write your signature there. If you don't, you'll leave a mark. And both his mother and father are both illiterate. As you can see here, his daughter Judith is also illiterate. She writes a signature like that, a mark instead of a signature. And his daughter Susanna Shakespeare does have a signature, but at the same time, a doctor, came to visit her in 1643, talking about her late husband's medical notes. And it seems from the way he's written his account that Susanna Shakespeare at the time couldn't tell the difference between the various handwritings on the different notes. And it seems to him that she was illiterate. He doesn't say it explicitly that she was illiterate, but he goes on for a few paragraphs on this, and it seems pretty clear that's his implication. So there you have it. All of the immediate relatives of William Shakespeare are illiterate. Now, as well as that, you can't get from the wider circle of William Shakespeare, I mean, first cousins, second cousins, anything literary going on, as far as I know, in terms of somebody writing poetry, writing books, or whatever, or music, or politics, or religion. Pretty much there is zippo about any of that. And now you have to ask yourself, okay, what does that prove? Okay, I mean, many people would say, look, you can get a literary genius, he can be brought up in poor circumstances, etc., etc. What does that mean? But I will counter that and say to you that in fact it is nonetheless more likely that the greatest genius in literary terms came from a milieu where other people around him, connected to him, also, had this literary flavour to their lives. Now, if you think about this, this has not been a, it's not looking down on Shakespeare to say that. We just have to think about this for a minute and think logically. I mean, presumably, genius, like literary genius or whatever, is in some sense genetic, logically, presumably. So hence you would expect to find some other person somehow connected to William Shakespeare who was also a poet of some description. That's not because if it's in the genes, it's going to emerge somewhere else as well. You can also see within communities and within families how the activity of writing poetry and writing plays or books would be fostered, if you like. You can see sort of a learned society, sort of a learned family structure. Whereas in other families, you get the impression that if they spent all their days writing poetry, somebody would, give them a kick and tell them, stop messing and go on with your labours and work at the wool or the gloves or whatever Shakespeare was working at. So you can see where genius is either fostered or not fostered. And in his family, there's no indication that it would be fostered. And another phenomenon is that maybe you reach the heights of literary genius because you're able to bounce off other people, because you're talking to other people who also have a tremendous knowledge of poetry and can appreciate this particular aspect of your work, and you can improve it because of that, etc., etc. So it is therefore a reasonable statement that the greatest literary genius the world has ever known was possibly more likely to come out of a serious literary milieu rather than have both his parents illiterate and his children illiterate, etc. So I think, it's not been condescending towards William Shakespeare to say that. It's a reasonable guess that the real candidate for Shakespeare would have could come from a literary milieu. So let's look at the literary milieu of our William Shakespeare. Again, just to lay with the point, he himself is described. And I'll read out the quote. It's a quote describing him in 1664 by Father John Lynch, writing in his Supplementum Aletheologiae. And he writes, he could write Italian poetry with elegance. Before that, however, he had been very successful in writing poetry in Latin, English, and Irish, and would yield to none in the precision and excellence of his verses in each of these languages. So that tells you what he thought about William Nugent. And there are numerous other references to his great learning, etc., as you can read in the aforementioned book. But just talking about his milieu, his immediate relatives, for example. His brother, Christopher Nugent, you can see there in this diagram. Obviously, the ones on the one line going horizontally are the one generation. So you can see his brother there, Christopher. He was a Latin poet, described as a Latin poet. He has written a number of books. One of them, which is a kind of a phrase book in Irish, English, and Latin, has become famous. And so famous, it was actually delivered to Queen Elizabeth II. When she came to Ireland not long ago. So it's a well-known work. And his son, that Christopher's son, was also a poet, a Gaelic poet, Gerald Nugent. And William Nugent's son himself, the guy that rebelled, etc., was also a poet. He wrote what is considered to be the first bit of sonnets written by an Irish person in England in 1604. It's called Cynthia, is the name of the book. It's a book of English poetry, as I say, written by William Nugent's son. And then you go into the first cousins, like his first cousin was Father Robert Nugent, the head of the Jesuits in Ireland for many years, and he's said to have written a Latin poet praising the Earl of Ormond of all things. And you can also see his correspondence in both English, Irish, and very frequently in Latin. He was a very great expert in Latin. And then a son of a brother of that first cousin, Seamus Dove Nugent, is also a Gaelic poet. And then a second cousin of our William Nugent is the Bishop of Meath, Dr. Thomas Dease, who was a famous Gaelic poet as well as an author in Latin. And then you take his first cousin on his mother's side, and you're talking with Father William Bath, who wrote 2 books on music and also wrote a famous work in Latin called Janua Linguarum, which was actually translated into 9 languages within 20 years, including an English edition, by the way. So you begin to see that he's the centre of an enormous degree of literary goings-on. His father, by the way, patronised a school of poetry. So I think, now again, it's not that you can prove anything by these kind of facts, but I think it's surely more likely that the greatest literary genius ever known would emerge out of that milieu and not the other milieu. I mean, again, you can't prove it on that alone, but it does seem more likely. And so you can see here that this, by the way, is his device, is his kind of proof of ownership, if you like, a signature on his own book. There is one of his books in existence. It's a book of poetry in Irish. It's called Dúnadh na Nugent, and it's in the National Museum, National Library in Ireland. And you can see here it says Eagsa Dúnadh, William MacMorris own Ross. So this Dúnadh, the poem book, is owned by William, the son of the Baron from Ross. And of course, William Nugent is the son of the Baron of Delphin, and as I described, he inherited Ross Castle on the shores of Loch Sheelin. And this page here is the front cover of his son's book, Cynthia. And I believe that this was put through the press by William Nugent himself after his son died. And I say that because there's a poem in Italian in it. And there's hardly all that many people connected to this milieu who had fluent Italian and could write Italian poetry. So I think that's why it was his father that put this through the press. And there's just a few pages from his brother Christopher's book. As I described it, it is a work that in a kind of way, Irish, Latin and English. And here's the first page is in Latin, the second page is in English, or these two pages anyway. And this is the front cover of one of his first cousin's books, writing an English book on music. And this is the same person. This is the front cover of the English version of his January Linguarum. Again, this is the first cousin of our William Nugent. And this is the Father Robert Nugent, again a first cousin of our William Nugent, on his father's side in this time. And this is a letter written to him by Bonaventure O'Hussey, who is a famous Gaelic poet. And it was intercepted by the authorities, so Father Robert never got it. But it just proves that they were fluent in Irish, which of course they were, all of these were. Now, I've described there mainly his family. Actually, on that diagram, it's only his family. But of course, he also had friends in this kind of literary milieu. Now, if you read down this account in the Irish State Papers for 1600, you can see that his son, who he was very close to and very closely connected to, was a good friend of Walter Stanihurst, a brother of the famous author Richard Stanihurst. And also, his son was another good friend of Thomas Sheldon. Now, Richard Stanihurst is a very famous author of the time in Latin and in English, and he's in Ireland, I think he's in Spain, he's in the Low Countries, he's writing all these very well-known, very important works. Very important work. This, for example, is an extract from Richard Stanihurst's entries, Richard Stanihurst's part of Holinshed's Chronicles. Holinshed's Chronicles is a very famous, well-known source for Shakespeare. It's a kind of a guidebook to England and Ireland of the time. And Shakespeare uses it a lot as a source for his plays, actually. And the Irish entries on this were written by Richard Stanihurst, as I say, the guy that's a friend of William Nugent's. And in the guidebook, he actually mentions William Nugent, and he says there that he wrote in the English tongue divers sonnets. He wrote, in other words, he wrote many poems in the English tongue, but nobody has ever found any of these poems unless they're in the works of Shakespeare. And this here is the history of Don Quixote. It's the first translation into the English language of the obviously very well-known Spanish work on Don Quixote, and that was translated by Thomas Sheldon, the man that's a close friend of the son of William Nugent. So you begin to see here that he is in the centre, our William Nugent, of a pretty lively literary milieu, which, as I say, I think does pushes slightly in the direction of saying that he's more likely to be Shakespeare than the actor. I mean, it's not a very big deal, but the degree to which he's a member of a literary milieu is remarkable. I mean, it really is remarkable. By the way, there are a whole load of other friends and poets and all that I could put in there, but they're just some of the main guys. So I think hopefully I've proven that point. Okay, so the obvious thing now that we're going to try and do is we're trying to look at the works of Shakespeare and see whether or not our candidate is likely to have written, whether or not our candidate has, if you like, the skills and the experience and the knowledge that we can see come across in the works of Shakespeare. Now, we'll break ourselves gently into this by mentioning music. There are a lot of people who feel that Shakespeare has a great knowledge of music, and you'll read books on the subject. It's not as big a deal as some of these other issues that'll come later, but nonetheless, people do feel that he was, an English scholar, and actually, or sorry, that he was a scholar of music, and actually, some would say particularly Irish music. As you can see here, there's even talk that he named the Irish bagpipes. Meaning what later evolved into the uilleann pipes, but it's not a very serious point. That writer rightly says it can be exaggerated. But anyway, there are numerous references to music in Shakespeare, so we might imagine, does our guy, what involvement does he have in music, or William Nugent? Is a reasonable question, but it becomes a much more interesting question when you add in a work written by this guy here. This guy is Grattan Flood, and he was an expert in Irish music about 1910. He wrote this particular book, The History of Irish Music. But the really interesting point about this work is that in the work he puts in a chapter on Shakespeare. And in that chapter he outlines that in his opinion some 11 contemporary Irish musical songs are secretly named in the works of Shakespeare. It's absolutely amazing. So he's taken these Irish tunes that he knows are Irish, and he's proven that they're quietly mentioned in Shakespeare. So that, of course, becomes of great interest when you're in this business of seeing, who is the real author of Shakespeare's work. So maybe we'll have a look and see if our candidate fits the bill as regards music. So here we are again, the familiar diagram. And again, all the ones in a line are all the one generation. Now, I can't find all that many specific references to William Nugent and music, except that when he was in rebellion, approximately 1582, the only person he had with him was his harper, who was named as Edmund McGillatane. So that obviously shows he is interested in music. And he is connected to some of the other guys on this list. For example, in 1591, it specifically stated that he was a good friend and was corresponding with his first cousin, Father William Bath, and even that they exchanged a code cipher. So anyway, his brother is connected to music. He's reckoned that he composed a lot of music, as you can see there. His first cousin, Father William Bath, as I say, is the author of two books on music, which are reckoned to be very important works. And he also modified and played the Irish harp. He actually modified the Irish harp. Then his first cousin on his father's side, Father William Nugent, again the head of the Jesuits, he changed the Irish harp as well, and he made a lot of modifications to it, which you can see at length in Father John Lynch's work, Cambrensis Eversis. So it's an amazing fact that actually his two first cousins, one on his mother's side and one on his father's side, both of them modified the Irish harp, were harpers and modified the Irish harp. It's amazing. Anyway, a brother of that, Father William Nugent, then also first cousin of our William Nugent, Father Nicholas Nugent, who was a priest and in jail because he was a priest. He also composed a lot of music. And then you have the Dr. Thomas Dease, the Bishop of Meath, mentioned earlier. He talks a lot about a timpan as a musical instrument, which you will see then in Shakespeare. So, yes, he's part of very much a musical milieu as well. Again, this is not, a big deal reference. It's not as important as the other issues that arise subsequently, but it's interesting anyway. And here's just the front page of William Bath's book on music, one of them. And you can see just a few pages there in the centre of it as well. Now, what's interesting about this is that these references to the Irish songs are hidden. Okay, and that's one of the great characteristics of the Irish references to Shakespeare. They're very much covert. They're always covert. They're kind of, you have to have a deep knowledge of Irish history, diction, whatever, to identify them. But once you do, they are there in abundance, but they're as I say, they are hidden. And a good example of that I'm going to play for you now. This is part of the play Henry V, Act 4, Scene 4. And it's done by the Grandel Theatre in St Louis.
Je pense que vous êtes un tillon de bonne qualité. Quality, quality, customary. Hello, gentlemen. What is that name? Discuss. Oh, sir.
Now, what you just heard there was an English soldier coming off to the right, and he's kind of capturing a French soldier in the wars which the play is describing. And the fact of the matter is that they speak different languages. The French person speaks French and the English person speaks English, so they can't really communicate in normal English. So you get these kind of rubbishy words, not very important speech because they can't understand one another. So hidden within these kind of rubbishy words is the name of an Irish harp melody, Colleen O Custure May, the girl from the banks of the Sure Me. Which is an Irish harp melody of the time, and it can be proven as such. So that's how you can see how the Irish reference is hidden. It's hidden in this language, this sort of made-up language between two people who can't understand each other. It's fascinating. He sneaks in the Irish language into this. And that, by the way, in case you're wondering, is the accepted interpretation of that piece of kind of rubbish language, that it is in fact the Irish language. So I just thought maybe you'd like to pause for a second and think about this for a minute. The Irish language is in Shakespeare. Whoever writes the works of Shakespeare also writes in the Irish language in it. And he wrote it in it so distinctly that hundreds of years later people can identify, look at that, he's speaking Irish. Whereas at the time, I imagine most people couldn't make out that it was Irish. So I put it to you that, in fact, there aren't that many non-Irish people who have the Irish language. Over the years, there's not that many at all. Even if you were Shakespeare and you heard some Irish harpists playing in a pub in London or whatever the story is, are you really going to remember the name of that song so exactly? You can remember the Irish, which you don't know otherwise, so exactly as to put it in a play like that. I don't think so. I think that the English writers of the time were always butchering Irish. They never really grasped it. They couldn't even get place names right or surnames right in Irish. So I think it is very significant that you have the Irish language in Shakespeare like that. And it's also very significant the way it's kind of hidden in that way. So there you go. There's the question of music in Shakespeare. We'll go on to the next section now. Okay, now we are getting closer to the important issues in regards to the writings of Shakespeare and linking that back to a particular candidate. It's always been considered to be the case that whoever is the real author of Shakespeare must have had an inside knowledge of the law, much more than just a passing knowledge. Somehow or other, he knew the sort of in-jokes the lawyers have. And this has been accepted for donkey's years, and they've written about it for donkey's years. You can see the titles of these books here, Commentary on the Law of Shakespeare, The Law of Shakespeare, and Shakespeare the Lawyer, or A Lawyer. And this is an Irish judge, Sir Dunbar Plunkett Barton, talking about Shakespeare and the law, and they all concluded that he had some sort of inside knowledge of the law. And you can see even in modern times, the lawyers love Shakespeare. So we want to see, is that true of our candidate? Is he a legal expert? Well, you can see here there are quite a few very specific references that really show that he did have considerable knowledge of the law. And again, his milieu is also very legalistic. I mean, look at the top generation there. You'll see, for example, the father of the man married to his aunt Catherine Nugent on his father's side, and his father married to his aunt Eleanor Preston, the father of the man married to his aunt Eleanor Preston on his mother's side, and the grandfather of his wife. If you go across that generation, that's Justice Sir Thomas Cusack, Justice Sir John Plunkett, and Justice James Bath. All three of them are justices. And then his uncle married to his aunt, Justice Robert Cusack, and his uncle married to his aunt on the other side is Justice John Bath. And then his uncle, on his father's side, a brother of his father, was Justice Nicholas Nugent. Now, the fact of the matter is he was very close to that uncle. You can see that throughout his life. No question about it. He was very close to that uncle. And that uncle is well known for his legal knowledge. So you can imagine that the house that he would have lived in, because he lived with his uncle for a while, must have had all these legal textbooks. And he certainly could have imbued some of the legal knowledge from his uncle. And not just his uncle, his first cousin, Edward Nugent, who was studying at Gray's Inns to be a lawyer. He was an agent of William Nugent during his court case in the 1590s. And then you can see his nephew there, Sir Christopher Nugent, is also a famous lawyer. So no question, we're hitting pay dirt there. He clearly has a lot of legal stuff going on. Here's just a page of one of his uncle's books. the author of this book sent down a copy to obviously his friend Nicholas Nugent as 1568. So that has to be William's uncle. There wouldn't be any other lawyer like that. And this here is a little extract from a Gaelic manuscript of the period. And it is a Gaelic Breton law tract called the Shancus Mór, which is a very well known, very widely copied old Breton law tract. And in it, the scribe is writing that he's in Dearhy, in the house of young William in Delvin, which is very likely to be our William. It's not proven, but Delvin is very associated with this family. I don't think there are any other Nugents at the time around Delvin called William. So that's very likely to be our man. So that shows that somebody was actually writing these Gaelic law tracts in William's house. So he seems to have knowledge even of Irish Breton law. And this letter here, for me, seals the deal. This is how you know for sure that William has a great expertise in law. This is an extract from the State Papers. It's an intercepted letter from Henry Sedengrave and John Fox in Paris. They are writing to William Nugent about the circumstances under which he draws down a kind of a pension from, I think, the Vatican. And in order to draw down, it's just a sum of money to keep him alive or whatever, and which he's able to charge to the Vatican. But in order to do this, they have to draw up a kind of a legal document called a procuration. And they say, so they're telling me here, you'll have to write out the proclamation to get this money. But they're saying there that we won't draw up the procuration itself because we know you're the expert in law, we leave it up to you. So these are the words. It says, the procuration whereby it may be of vigour and force in law, because we know your own skill and practice therein to be better than ours. So that shows, clear as a bell. The man was a legal expert. So, I mean, our candidate, he really ticks all the boxes. So that's the last box, ticks the legal one. We'll head over to some other issues now. Now we enter the list with a somewhat more controversial aspect of the works of Shakespeare. A lot of people feel that the works of Shakespeare show some person writing it who seems to defend and encourage Catholicism. Now, the fact of the matter is this is debated for a millennium. Right? Was he Catholic? It's been a huge debate between Protestant and Catholic writers as to whether or not Shakespeare, the real author, was a closet Catholic or whether he was Protestant. It goes on for literally centuries, and it goes up and down. But I think it's fair to say that Catholicism has come out in front on this. And if you look, for example, at this article written in 2012, they referred there to an article in Osservatore Romano, which is the official Vatican newspaper. And if you read it down there, the official Vatican newspaper is saying definitively that the Vatican newspaper opted for an open vote on that, but concluded that there was no doubt that the writer who authored the material was a Catholic who concealed his religious beliefs because of the anti-Catholic persecution of Elizabeth in England. So the official Vatican newspaper is absolutely laying it on the line. They reckon that the real author was definitely Catholic. They're stepping out of the question whether it's the Earl of Oxford, but anyway, in general, I think it's fair to say that at least Catholic authors are now saying that undoubtedly whoever wrote the works of Shakespeare was a kind of a closet Catholic. And the reason why Catholicism seems to have come out on top of this great debate between whether he really was Catholic or Anglican, etc., are a number of works that have come out recently, particularly works by this lady, Claire Asquith, which have got a lot of publicity. I mean, she was interviewed on EWTN, and it's gone all around the world. This book and other works that she's done, which have gone through the works of Shakespeare and really figured out what the story is, where he's coming from. And she absolutely says, basically, that William Shakespeare was this secret Catholic author. He's winding into his works secret code words, if you like, which is proselytizing, if you like, the Catholic faith as opposed to the Protestant one. Now it's important to understand in this that we're not referring actually to too many explicit references. We're referring rather to coded references, but it is nonetheless persuasive coded references. Now, to illustrate that, I'm going to go into one of the history plays, Henry V. And I'm just want to talk about this because in this scene in Henry V, you have the only Irish candidate in the whole Shakespeare canon. Okay, the Shakespeare canon is whatever, it's 1,000 pages. You get 19 lines stated by an Irish character. 19 lines out of 1,000 pages. It's just amazing. Every single other nationality in Western Europe you hear about at length in the works of Shakespeare. But Ireland only gets these 19 lines by this character. And he's introduced here, as you can see in this play. If you look at the first red line on your left there, you'll see he's described as a very valiant gentleman of faith. So you think about that line, a very valiant gentleman of faith. Now, if faith is supposed to be kind of a sort of, a kind of curse word slightly at the end of the sentence. Whereas, in fact, of course, if you think about it, maybe he means that he's a very valiant gentleman as regards religion. It doesn't seem an unreasonable way of looking at it. And the man's name is Captain MacMorris. And if I could just, this is the Irish candidate, Captain MacMorris. And if I could just, to talk about him for a little. I mean, obviously, the question is, who is the real Captain MacMorris? Why does he use the word, the character Captain MacMorris? Well, at the time, there was a very famous Catholic champion. I mean, for the Normans in Ireland, he would be the great sort of Catholic champion of the late 16th century. His name was Captain James Fitzmaurice Fitzgerald. Now, Fitzmaurice is just the Norman way of writing son of Morris. The Normans in Ireland copied the French because they originally were French. So Fil, F-I-L-S, is the French for son of. So they made Fitz out of that, F-I-T-Z. So James Fitzmaurice Fitzgerald, his father was Morris, hence he's James Fitzmaurice, and Morris, and his surname is Fitzgerald. So in this letter, I'm just giving you an Irish letter actually written by James Fitzmaurice Fitzgerald, and in it he's just describing his name, and he has, so James is off camera there to your right, and then that's James MacMorris. So he's the son of Morris Muick an Iarla. He's the son of Morris, and his father was actually a son of the Earl of Desmond. So it's the son of Morris, and whose turn was the son of the Earl. And I'm just pointing out, therefore, that James Fitzmaurice Fitzgerald, this famous captain, he wrote his name MacMorris. As you can see there, that is actually his handwriting in Irish. So hence, he's always known as Captain. So hence, Captain James MacMorris. Again, this candidate that we have here is Captain MacMorris. So if he's going to be a valiant gentleman in the faith, it seems possible that they're referring there to Captain James Fitzmaurice Fitzgerald, which is amazing because he's such a big Catholic rebel figure. It's incredible. Anyway, the point I'm trying to bring up with this scene in Shakespeare, I'm trying to bring forward to you this idea that within the works of Shakespeare you get these little code words that indicate that there's a lot of religious stuff going on behind the scenes. So as I say, get back to that sentence again, a very valiant gentleman of faith. Again, you're thinking to yourself, maybe the way that's written, he means he's a valiant gentleman as regards religion. And then you go down and look at the next red lines. In the true disciplines of the wars, look you, of the Roman disciplines. So they have an argument here, these captains before a siege in the time of Henry V. And supposedly, they're having an argument as the best way to conduct a siege from Roman times. Now, realistically, in medieval England, they just weren't tapping into the knowledge of Roman warfare because it was pointless. The Romans were dealing with a totally different situation. If you want to know how to conduct warfare in 1400s or that kind of period, you don't consult a Roman author. It's just the warfare is totally different. But supposedly they have this argument about the Roman way of conducting war. But of course, if you bring in Roman as an adjective, the fact of the matter is that you're beginning to talk Roman Catholicism. And now you can see where Claire Asquith is coming from, that they're using these sort of hidden code words. To use Roman, which as I say seems to me to be out of place in this scene, is nonetheless very much in place if you're having a religious controversy, because obviously you use Roman in place of Roman Catholicism. And look at the phrase, the disciplines of the wars. In theology they refer a lot to to dogma on the one side and disciplines and whatever. And then you can see on the right hand side there, when Captain MacMorris is talking, he's supposed to be cursing. So he says, "So Christ save me." Well, that's obviously, you know, a religious thing there, clearly. And incidentally, for the red line that goes downwards there, you can see 3 lines issued by Captain MacMorris, which are really very remarkable. Now again, in the whole works of Shakespeare, you get 19 lines ever said by an Irish person. That's it. 19 lines out of 1,000 pages. And of those 19 lines, you get these 3 lines, which I'll speak for you now. It says, "Of my nation, what is my nation? Is a villain and a bastard and a knave and a rascal, what is my nation? Who talks of my nation?" I mean, it's a remarkable few lines, you know. It's anyway, if you read it, you might get the impression that maybe the author himself is passionate about his nation, and that's why it's written that way. And here is the top half of that scene, and again, you can see all these little code words that seem to indicate that actually they're having a religious dispute and not a dispute about warfare. So you'll see he will maintain his argument as well as any military man in the world in the disciplines of the pristine wars of the Romans. You see, the pristine wars of the Romans, that indicates that they're referring there to Christianity as it was experienced in the early days of the church. And you see, there's a big element in the Reformation whereby the Protestants said they were reverting back to the pristine Christianity before you had this overlay of the church on top. And then anyway, you have Captain MacMorris coming back, "By Christ's law, 'tis ill done." By Christ's law, you see, like, and then he says, "My father's soul," and he says, "So Christ saved me law," and then the Welsh guy is talking about "a few disputations with you, as partly touching or concerning the disciplines of the war, the Roman wars, in the way of argument." So he's having a disputation, argument with regard to the Roman stuff. So again, I'm just making the point here, in case you're wondering where does this come from. Why do people say that the writer of the Shakespeare works was Catholic? It's because it's full of these little code words that make you think that actually there's a lot of religion behind the scenes of the work. And it's not unreasonable. When you read Claire Asquith's work and you look at some of these code words, they do make sense. It is fair enough to say that some of these texts have a religious argument going on, not just the overt historical stuff. And that whoever was the real writer was, if you like, a Catholic champion. He's sneaking in here Catholic doctrine and he's defending it. You know, so consequently, we have our candidate for Shakespeare. We want to see could he be the guy, Catholic champion. Now, you know, but before we do that, let's just have a look at the actor. Because, you see, what's happening is that Claire Asquith et al. Have got a lot of fame with their books, and so people are going back to William Shakespeare of Stratford, and they're seeing, can he be this Catholic champion that we now can see from the works? And they do have a couple of things to go on, but not much, in my opinion. For example, his daughter, Susanna, was charged, along with 21 people, with not taking Holy Communion on Easter Sunday in the Anglican Church. Of course, it was officially the law that you had to go to Anglican Church and you had to take Holy Communion, and if you're a Catholic, you wouldn't like doing so. At the same time, if you were lazy, you wouldn't like doing so either, and you might just let it pass and get a bit of a fine. It's not an earth-shattering reference. There's also a similar reference to John Shakespeare from 1592. But in that case, his name is listed along with others that didn't go to church for fear of process for debt. In other words, they weren't turning up at the Mass in case this debt server would come and present them with documents looking for money. And they actually write that into the reference. So there's not much in his life that seems to indicate he's Catholic. Except, in 1757, there's a record of a bricklayer working on the roof of their old house in Stratford-upon-Avon, finding among the rafters the spiritual last will and testament of John Shakespeare. Now, this document is much disputed. It's not in existence anymore, and it was only copied into a works. And it's like, if you like, a copy of a copy that you get now. But nonetheless, it seems that it's a copy of a document that was floating around Italy. It was by a fellow called Carlo Borromeo. And consequently, if it was a later 18th century forgery, they did a good job of it because they seem to be copying an authentic writer from the 1570s. I mean, I would say, okay, that could be authentic, but it's still not all that earth-shattering. If John Shakespeare did write, it's not that he wrote this whole spiritual testament. It's just that you have the spiritual testament. You kind of put your own name in the various spots, where people pray for him or whatever. I might indicate that at some point he became a closet Catholic, or some other John Shakespeare became a closet Catholic, because it's a reasonably common name at the time. You don't actually know it's his father anyway. But it's still not earth-shattering. Okay, it's interesting. It might indicate some Catholicity, if you like, in William Shakespeare's family, but I don't think it's, something to write home about. Now, about William Shakespeare himself, let's see, does he have any sort of Catholic stuff? Now, the only thing that they talk about there is his purchase of the gatehouse of Blackfriars, former Dominican convent in London. So Blackfriars, as the name suggests, used to be the Dominican place in London. It was taken over and was actually a playhouse at this time by 1613, and then William Shakespeare invests in the gatehouse of it. Now, people are pointing out that since it's the former Dominican place, and since the gatehouse was then subsequently let out to John Robertson, whose brother was a Catholic priest, then consequently the idea of William Shakespeare buying this gatehouse was for religious reasons, and consequently they go on to talk about that he was a closet Catholic, etc. I think that's way overdone again. I mean, the gatehouse, as I say, is right beside the former theatre. There's a theatre now in Blackfriars. So presumably he's passing by this every day, going to the theatre, and when he wants to invest in it, he hears it's coming up on the market. He wants to invest in a place. He decides to invest near the theatre, where all his friends are, and presumably where he hopes to continue to go back to the stage at a later stage. So I don't know, can you make so much of that? But that's all you get. Okay, on that diagram is the full text of anything that you can link William the Shakespeare, the actor, to Catholicism. But remember, we're saying, if Claire Ascott is correct, and is now the modern theory, we're saying that William Shakespeare, whoever wrote the works, was a real Catholic champion. He's writing all these works, and he's sneaking in all of this Catholic stuff into it to sort of proselytize the Catholic faith. And yet, that's all you get. That's all we know about William Shakespeare of Stratford as being a Catholic champion, and I think it's poor enough. It's not really all that persuasive. Whereas, if you go with this Irish candidate and you want to see whether could be a Catholic champion, I'm telling you, you have just entered into the spider's lair. You have just gone to the centre of the web. It's unbelievable the degree to which William Nugent fits the bill as a Catholic champion. His whole life is devoted to that, and indeed, to an enormous extent, his friends and family are in the same category. So you can see here, for example, one of his Gaelic poems. A number of his Irish poems survive, and in the Gaelic poem it says, "In my dream it was a troop of slender-handed white monks that I saw in conflict with the foreigners." And then, of course, he launches a rebellion in 1581, partly because to defend and assert the Catholic faith. There is a specific reference in a French work that he witnessed a Eucharistic miracle. And in 1600, he launched a religious controversy. He actually went in there and spoke to this Protestant in Dublin, and he said, "Look, I'm going to be able to prove the authenticity of the Catholic faith, etc., etc." And his son was a priest. So absolutely big-time Catholic champion. And you can look at that diagram if you can, and you can see there his whole family is unbelievably well connected in that regard. It's really the centre of Counter-Reformation. I would say Counter-Reformation Britain or Ireland. But Ireland, obviously, specifically. This is the front page of a book that describes his religious controversy, which you can see there. This book was written by Henry Fitzsimons, who was a Jesuit priest who was jailed in Dublin Castle. So William Nugent starts the controversy, and then Fitzsimons takes up the cudgels. And this might be a portrait of his first cousin, who obviously was a Jesuit, as I described. The guy who wrote a lot of books and modified the harp, and William Bath. I mean, I say it might be his portrait. I'm not sure whether it is his portrait or whether it's a generic picture that you get in some of those works. I couldn't tell you. Anyway, it's dated 1614. This man here is a very, very, very important figure in Counter-Reformation Europe. He's one of the most prominent, certainly Irish figures in the whole Counter-Reformation surge of, say, 1620s, 1630s, or whatever. And his name was Friar Lavelin Nugent. He took the name Francis when he joined joined the Capuchins, and he's the founder of the Capuchins in Ireland. He's a distant relative of William Nugent, but he is a friend of the family. We know that because there is specific reference to that effect. And as I say, he's a big shot in the whole of Counter-Reformation Europe, as you can read in his biography, his great biography by F.X. Martin there. This is the church where he would have got baptized and where he would have gone to church a lot. In Delvin, beside the old castle in Delvin. That's the run up to it. That's the arch for it, and that's the inside of it. And I'm mentioning this church specifically because, as I said, in this French book there is a specific mention that William and his brother Christopher saw a Eucharistic miracle. It's an amazing phenomenon. It was said that the host kind of became alive and all that. You can read it down there. He is described there. He's the Baron of Screen and a brother of the Baron of Delvin. He was sometimes known as the Baron of Screen, and he's certainly a brother of the Baron of Delvin. So the two of them saw this Eucharistic miracle, which is amazing. So and as I described earlier, one of the important centres of religion for this family would be Fore Abbey. And if you read down through Shakespeare, you get all these sort of areas of, where you have a kind of a hermit living out in one of the plays, for example. You get a hermit called Father Patrick living in a kind of a hermit's cell. I've forgotten the word that was used in Shakespeare's plays, but you get that. You get a little bit of that, of course, in Romeo and Juliet as well. So this would be the place if you were to project that onto Ireland. And incidentally, in one of those plays that describes the hermit in the cell, they're referring to Father Patrick as the person in the cell. Well, that, as I think I said earlier, that hermit cell, which again is the castle-like looking building on your left in the foreground, that was occupied by a Father Patrick Beglin just at the time of Shakespeare. So it's a bit of a coincidence. And so hence, I think you can definitely tick that box. There's no debate about it. This William Nugent really would be a Catholic champion. That much is no question about that at all. Okay, the next thing that you can see in the works of Shakespeare, and hence, if you want to find out who the real writer is, we have to match to the life of William Nugent, is this idea of politics and the whole turmoil of Shakespeare, rebellions and executions and people in jail, but also court life and diplomacy and all that. See, the point is that, okay, right, you can write about it. You can write a book tomorrow about that. I can write a book tomorrow about that. But the fact of the matter is that if you could have lived it, if you actually experienced this type of stuff, then you could write it much better. Now remember, we are referring to a person that is reckoned to be the greatest literary figure of all time, and people hundreds of years later tap into what he's written and really derive an awful lot from it. So, particularly from politics. Now, here, for example, is a quote from Enoch Powell, who, of course, was an Irish government minister. And he was interviewed on a documentary in 1992, and he writes there, he says, and he's talking about, thinking about Shakespeare. I says, at that time, I had been a member of the cabinet and had been in politics for 20 years and had some idea of what it's like in the kitchen. And my astonishment was to discover that these were the works, that is the works of Shakespeare, of somebody who had been in the kitchen. They are written by someone who had lived the life, who has been part of the life of politics and power, who knows what people feel when they're near to the centre of power, near to the heat of the kitchen. It's not something which can be transferred. It's not something on which an author, just an author, can be briefed, oh, this is how it happens. It comes straight out of experience, straight out of personal observation, straight out of personal feeling. That's the difference which comes over you when you read Shakespeare detached from the Stratfordian fantasy. Now, he's not the only one that says that. There are numerous other big political figures who do the same thing, like Bismarck and countless other people over centuries. They're saying that in the works of Shakespeare, you get a real insight into this kind of political intrigue and diplomacy, etc., that really you couldn't successfully write unless you had some deep knowledge of it. Now, remember, again, there is no connection between William of Stratford and the court and political life in England or anywhere else. Okay, forget about it. He has no connection to that we know of, and we would know of it. So, but the real author seems to have that. He seems to have lived the life that he then describes in the play. But the problem with this is that how could anybody have lived the life described there? You just read the plays, you have these rebellions, you have these, and it's all about betrayal, rebellion, religion, and all kinds of diplomatic goings on. And of course, whoever's the real author has to be a great poet, etc. Well, consider this. You see here the usual diagram, and you see here what we can say about William Nugent. In 1577, he was jailed by the English government in connection with the row of regard to cess, which is kind of a tax. 1581, he launches his own rebellion, which was partly because of religion. Then 1582 to 4, he's exiled Scotland, France, Rome, and Spain, and he's dealing with the monarchs of all those countries. Absolutely. He also met Queen Elizabeth and all that. And then in 1590 to 94, he's conducted a huge court case involving the court like in Dublin and in London, and it's a very involved case, and he meets the Queen and all the rest of it as part of that. So it's huge knowledge of politics, rebellion, warfare. Absolutely. It's remarkable. But also, so does his immediate family. They're all full of that. So his uncle is attacked by his illegitimate brother Edmund, and his father dies on campaign against the English. His uncle, of course, is executed because of his alleged involvement in his own rebellion. His brother, Christopher Nugent, is absolutely regularly in jail, accused of treason. And when he's not in jail accused of treason, he's out of bail and launching wars against the Irish, virtually all the time. His own son, of course, joins with Hugh O'Neill and becomes one of his leading lieutenants in the Pale, and then has to emigrate to the continent in exile. And then his nephew, Richard Nugent, who is the then Baron of Delvin, he succeeded to be Baron of Delvin. He has a huge political career. I mean, he's all kinds of stuff. And even his other nephew, a brother of that, Richard, was selected by the Irish leaders to go to Spain to negotiate on behalf of the Irish Catholics. So, I mean, really, he's the centre of a massive ferment of political, military, betrayal and all the rest of it. Absolutely. No question about that. Here, for example, is simply the index to the state papers of Ireland, to the calendar of state papers of Ireland for 1606 to 1608 period, and that's just on his nephew, what is going to be the first Earl of Westmeath. He's then the Baron of Delvin, and you can just read that down through the kind of career that he's leading, and they all led that. That's his nephew, but also his brother Christopher, this nephew's father, lived all that kind of life. He's hopping out of jails. He's going down he's escaping out of jail by going down a rope in a basket, and you can read it all down there. It's just amazing. And this, for example, is the proclamation they issued when he escaped from jail in about 1607. he was jailed as part of the Flight of the Earls controversy, and. So we can see that this is his milieu. Now, maybe we can hammer the point home here for a minute. When William Nugent rebelled, as I say, he was exiled. He exiled Scotland, went to the continent, came back from the continent to launch a rebellion again, if you like, in Ireland, was caught, or kind of gave himself in semi-caught. If you like. He just realised that he couldn't do anything else. But as part of the deal, he got pardoned without the attainder being lifted. But as part of the deal, he had to write a letter outlining the political environment. And this is extremely interesting because in this letter he gives you some insight to his political activities. Now, I think this letter is very interesting because this letter really shows, I think, the kind of political insight that you're going to get in the works of Shakespeare. I think this kind of clears up, this really hammers the point home. I know it's a long letter, but it's fascinating to read actually William Nugent telling you a story, if you like. This is the authentic voice now of William Nugent. So if I may read out this letter, I apologise it's a bit long, but hopefully you'll find it interesting. So he explains at the beginning why he decided to write the letter. Right honourable, to the end it may appear unto your lord how greatly I desire to ransom my late offence, by performing every part the duty, observance and service that may be required at the hands of a loyal subject. I have, in the occurrences which at the present offer themselves, taken occasion to discharge me in that behalf by delivering unto your lordship such intelligences in this true and simple declaration as I could come by and in my judgment might import the state to have knowledge of. In the last Easter week, McGeoghegan's son and I were sent for by the Cardinal of Como, who told us that it was the Pope's pleasure that we should with all speed take our journey to Paris, where he said the Nuncio Apostolic and the Bishop of Glasgow should direct us in all that might occur. After our arrival at Paris, the Nuncio directed us to the Duke of Guise, who indeed procured our coming from Rome, as we understood by himself. He sent us in company of certain Scottish lairds and household servants of the King of Scots into Scotland with the first shipping, and gave us 2 letters. The one directed to the king, which bore but ordinary commendation, the other to the Master of Grey, a person of importance and in great secrecy about the king, and that was in cipher. What it contained, other than a more effectual commendation of us the bearers than the other letter did, I cannot say, for so much only did the Master of Grey disclose unto us of it. As often as I, with others of my countrymen, had conference with the Cardinal Como, he would utter that the expedition for Ireland must come from the King of Spain, that the Pope was too far off to take it in hand, that from time to time he sent his direction to the nuncio in Spain to solicit the king for it, and the king promised to proceed in the matter when opportunity should serve. I was told by some that were privy to these practices that the Pope would bear a good part of the charge, and that seemeth to me likely, because he hath already twice laid out of his treasure to maintain the attempt first to Stukely, and after to James Fitzmaurice and the Italians and Spanish that landed at Dunanore. Wherefore he would not fail now, when he conceived the more than a hope that the business will succeed. It was thought the expedition should have set forward by the last September at the furthest, which might be conjectured by the haste made in sending of my companion and me from Rome, and therefore to be looked for this next year, except it be prevented by Her Majesty, interrupted by the wars of Flanders, or disturbed by the Turk or some other potentate. The Duke of Guise had correspondence with the Pope, Spain and Scotland, whereby it may be gathered that though there be no immediate nor direct dealings between the King of Scots and the Pope or the King of Spain, yet he practised it with either, meaning each of them, indirectly by the intermediation of Guise. This a man might perceive by the diligence of Coma in the dispatch of my fellow and me from Rome to Paris, procured by Guise, the nuncio and he concurring in the sending of us to Scotland. At my being in Scotland, when I told the Master of Grey that I was to come to Ireland, he cast out these words: We may comprehend what God purposeth, but accept what he let it. It passeth the compass of man's wit to find out how the plot laid for the relief of Ireland may fail. I conceive upon these words that the force intended to be sent must be great, and being so, methinks they would rather resolve to land in England than in Ireland. The reason is that upon England depends the consequence of both realms, which once won there needs be no more for Ireland. Besides that there is not in Ireland to maintain any great force, for it would not quit the cost, neither is a small force able to keep it. More particular intelligence of these matters I could not learn, for the persons upon whom they depend are not wont to commit the special points of importance to private men. William Nugent. Among the circumstances that move me in duty to double and forewarn that matters be now in ripeness for the purpose of the effecting this combination, one is that at my being in Rome and after my coming to Paris, the Viscount Baltinglass advised me in letters of his that he had promised from the king assuring the execution of the business for Ireland. So maybe that gives you some idea of the kind of language he uses and the kind of political insights that he has. I think it's very obvious that he's big into international political intrigue. But also, I think we can hit the nail on the head a bit more directly. I think we can see in the works of Shakespeare some kind of incidents that we can more directly link to the life of William Nugent. So, for example, in the court case in 1593 that I described, he talks about it here. He says that in one particular incident, the sheriff dismissed the prisoner for certain money and for the use, or rather the abuse, of his sister. So somebody bribed the sheriff to release the prisoner, partly with money and partly with this person's sister for presumably sexual goings-on. And yet, then if you go link that back to the works of Shakespeare, you have in Measure for Measure, you have Isabella agrees to sleep with Angelo, the acting ruler, in order to free her brother Claudio. So it's a very similar kind of incident. And then also Measure for Measure, you have the Duke there. He's what goes around the city disguised as a friar. But in 1584, we can see that William Nugent himself was disguised as a friar. It was one of the ways he hid. And then in turn in 1573, you have this reference to his marriage. What happened was he with 20 other armed people, he entered the house where the girl was and just pinched her away and married her then, causing a tremendous feud between the two families. That's the families of the Plunketts on the one hand and the Nugents on the other. But if you look at that and you compare the origin of the first scenes of Othello and Romeo and Juliet, you can see absolutely how this man William Nugent really does have the life experiences that allow him to write the works of Shakespeare. So I think that's actually quite a persuasive area. When you look at politics, you look at warfare, you see him living the life, and you see it in the works of Shakespeare. So that solves that section. Okay, so up to this, what we've done is we've looked at the life of William Shakespeare, and we said that yes, he's the ideal candidate, if you like. He ticks all the boxes, and I don't really believe that anybody else could tick all those boxes that he has. But maybe we could find a few bits and pieces that really hit home, really match the life of William Nugent more directly. For this, we need to discuss a subject called an attainder, which is something that I suspect a lot of viewers of this video haven't heard about before. An attainder is where you go into rebellion and, in Tudor times, and the state might the state might decide to pass an act of parliament, an act of parliament stripping you of your titles and other stuff, and they call that then an act of attainder. It's actually a bill that's passed through the parliament. It's not within the compass of the king or whatever directly. It's the parliament that does this. Now the critical aspect of this is that it strips you of your title if you're a nobleman of the time, meaning you're the Earl of Westmeath or something. Now you can no longer be the Earl of Westmeath, but not only do you not to become the Earl of Westmeath, but your son, say your eldest son, who would normally inherit the title, he can't inherit it. So it's a very strange phenomenon whereby you get a law that, if you like, passes through your blood. Because your sons and your ancestors your descendants can't take this title, which might have lasted for 100 years or whatever. So for this reason, the aristocracy hated this act of attainder. It was really a big deal. They never liked an act of attainder passed against their particular titles. And they had kind of nicknames or sort of references to it that you'll read in the literature. For example, here's William Shakespeare. Here's the works of Shakespeare talking about attainder. And it said, "Was not thy father, Richard Earl of Cambridge, for treason executed in our late king's days? And by his treason standst not thou attainted, corrupted," meaning kind of corrupted in blood, and exempt from ancient gentry. "His trespass yet lives guilty in thy blood, until thou be restored thou art a yeoman. And this blot that they object against your house shall be wiped out." So you get the idea. Okay, the way that they used to talk about the kind of the metaphor of the attainder was that it was a blood stain. Because of this phenomenon that the punishment went down through your bloodstream in a kind of way, because your sons couldn't inherit and all the rest of it. So you get the idea. It's a blood stain, it's a blot. These are the kind of words they use to describe it, as Shakespeare himself, as the writer of the works of Shakespeare says himself there in Henry IV. But also, we can use an example from the two Nugent brothers, our William and his brother Christopher. So Christopher, writing in 1580, writes, "I protest unto your lordship, there is nothing in this world whereof I make more account than mine ancestors were never spotted in blood, and have always from the conquest been servitors to the crown of England, which honour by them attained and to me descended, I mean not to deface nor lose." So obviously he calls it a blood spot. You've spotted in blood. That's obviously the attainder again. Now, William Nugent himself, when he wrote that confession and that letter that you just heard not long ago, he adds at the end of it, "The stain now abiding in my name, which makes me ever loathsome unto myself, may be wiped away. The most unfortunate and hateful to himself, William Nugent." So he's referring there at the stain to himself. It would be the attainder, and it has the effect of making him, unfortunate and hateful to himself, etc. Now, I'm talking about this because you go in and you read the sonnets, and you have in your idea all of this terminology relating to the attainder. Like, I'm sure the vast majority of people who are reading the sonnets have never heard about the attainder, and nor did I, in fact, until I read Elizabeth Hickey's book. And so this idea comes from Elizabeth Hickey, and it's a marvellous idea. It really does resonate with you if you read the sonnets. It's really, in my opinion, you have to conclude that the writer of the sonnets had an attainder. It just matches so well. So here are just a few references, and they're only just a few. You could get a lot more references. So, for example, in Sonnet 26, "When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I'll all alone beweep my outcast state, yet in these thoughts myself almost despising. Now you link that back to what you just heard about William Nugent, how he describes himself, how he hates himself, etc. And then we have Sonnet 36. So shall those blots that do with me remain. Again, the blots. Then Sonnet 88, I am attainted. Well, that's a big clue there, right? Then you have Sonnet 109, so that myself bring water for my stain. Never believe, though in my nature reigned, all frailties that besiege all kinds of blood, that it could so preposterously be stained. So again, you get this blood stain thing going on. And Sonnet 111, the guilty goddess of my harmful deeds, thence comes it that my name receives a brand. Now, it runs all the way through the sonnets, this whole attainder phenomenon, and not just the sonnets. You can read references to it in some of the long poems of Shakespeare. You think about Macbeth. Lady Macbeth is after committing the murder, and then she's trying to get this blood stain out, and you can't wash it out. And so it occurs all the time with Shakespeare. You'll find lots of references to it in the aforementioned book that we're talking about here. But as well as that, you have reference from a reference from Ben Jonson. Now, Ben Jonson, as I described earlier, was also a playwright and poet of this period, who seems to have known Shakespeare. Now, he writes a dedicatory verse in the collected works of Shakespeare, known as the first folio, and in it he mentions a mysterious reference to a kind of a blot. It's almost as if he's saying that the author, when he's writing, kind of writes an ink blot. But in fact, he then elaborates on it in a much later poem. And if you read it down there, he says, if you can't read that, you can follow it in this quotation. I remember the players have often mentioned it as an honour to Shakespeare, that in his writing, whatsoever he penned, he never blotted out line. My answer hath been, would he had blotted 1,000, which they thought a malevolent speech. I had not told posterity this, but for their ignorance, who choose that circumstance to commend their friend by wherein he most faulted. So they're referring there to the, obviously, that poem makes no sense. I mean, on the surface of it, what is he going on about? What do we do about blots? I mean, who cares about blots? But you think again about the attainder, and you read that, and I'm telling you, it's fascinating. You really get the impression that, again, he's somehow referring to the attainder. And incidentally, since we're talking about the sonnets there for a minute, I might point out to you that this is the title page of the first publication of the sonnets. And in the title page, there's a reference there to the person who wrote the sonnets, and he's described simply as Mr. W.H. Nobody really knows why the author of the sonnets is listed as W.H. Obviously, if it's William Shakespeare, it would be W.S. So why W.H.? Well, Elizabeth Hickey pointed out that if you look at the signature of William Nugent, now there above you have William Nugent's signature, the N of Nugent looks like a K and above there, but below on the bottom signature you look at the N of Nugent and it looks an awful lot like a H. So you can imagine the circumstances where he sends a letter in and he signs it WH, but because of the way he writes an N normally, it's interpreted as a H, and that's the explanation. So it's very interesting. So and it's very now. So that is my first non-circumstantial proof, if you like, that I'd like to present to you, or evidence. This idea of the attainder, it's extremely interesting. There is no other candidate for Shakespeare put forward by anybody, as far as I know, that suffered an attainder. So if you believe that Shakespeare suffered an attainder, and it's very easy to come to that conclusion if you read the sonnets, then you're saying William Nugent is our man, and certainly not Shakespeare at Stratford-upon-Avon, who obviously didn't suffer from an attainder. So that's the first piece of direct evidence. Now, the second piece of direct evidence I'd like to put forward to you relates to this monument. This is in Donaghadee Church, which is it's now a kind of forest park in County Kildare in Ireland, and it's the side altar of a working Church of Ireland church. And as you can see here, just above the image of the statues, if you like, are two plaques built into the monument. Now, it's very hard to date those plaques, but presumably they date to the same time as the overall monument, and the overall monument is dated to to presumably the time when the wife died. These are tombs, and the tomb was created for the wife of the person who had died. She had died approximately 1617. So these are the two plaques you can see written, what's written there. And I put it to you that it's very similar to the kind of language used on the Shakespeare monuments in Stratford-upon-Avon. So there's the two monuments you get at the grave of Shakespeare from Stratford-upon-Avon in the church in Stratford-upon-Avon. Now you see it here exactly, the two texts, okay? This is the Shakespeare monument of Stratford-upon-Avon. This is this Donaghadee monument in Ireland from approximately the same period, exact same period. Now look at the language used on the Donaghadee monument. I mean, it's very Shakespearean sounding. I mean, you read that, and I think, "Stay a passenger that hasty foot, this stone delivers thee a message from a famous twin that here entombed be. Live for virtue passed wealth," etc., etc. So, who did this monument? Who wrote these plaques? Well, we don't know. But that's the lady for whom they're commemorating. It's the wife of the man on the right. And she died, as I say, 1617. Her name was Julia. Her married name is Aylmer. But her maiden name is Julia Nugent. She's a niece of our William Nugent. So you have these two plaques written in this very Shakespearean style and very similar to the plaques written at Stratford-upon-Avon. And, very coincidental. It's worth thinking about. I think it does, again, bring Shakespeare back into the life of William Nugent. Now, this is the gravestone of William Nugent in Screen in County Meath in Ireland. And this is his heraldic crest kind of thing on the left here. Now you can see it. It's like a little helmet. You get a little bird on top and the usual type of shield thing. Look at the way the helmet is. It's kind of put it as a side like that. Now this here in turn is the first version of the funeral monument to Shakespeare in the Stratford-upon-Avon church. If you go to Stratford-upon-Avon now, you'll see this kind of figure of a guy. But this person went along, I think it's in the 1650s, and drew this elaborate diagram of the original version of the Shakespeare monument in Stratford. And look at the image that he has on the top of the structure. You have this helmet, you have this little bird. Now the heraldic crest on the right there is the Shakespeare one. But look at that little bird, look at that little helmet, look at the kind of flowery stuff that goes left and right. Now I'm telling you, no question, there is a real comparison to be made. I respectfully submit. So again, on the left there you get the monument to this Irish guy in Stratford-upon-Avon. On the right there you get the monument. On the left there you get William Nugent in County Meath, and on the right there you get William Shakespeare in Stratford-upon-Avon. And I think it's remarkable the comparison that you can make for that part of both monuments. It's really uncanny, and I think it's way more than coincidental. I mean, for the front cover image of this book, I admit that it could be coincidental, but I'm not inclined to dismiss that image there. I think it's too coincidental. I can't explain it, but I'm thinking that that would link the two people, R. William Nugent and William Shakespeare Stratford. So we end up with our book again, and so you get more details on all this there if you wanted and other references. And you can buy the book at lulu.com, LULU.com, or numerous other online bookstores. And I hope you like it anyway, and hope you've learned something. Thank you very much.